Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Cameron Petrie. I'm actually from the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, but I'm also a trustee at the Ancient India and Iran Trust, which is an independent research institution based in Cambridge that is broadly interested in the history, heritage, and cultures of ancient India and ancient Iran, and the other areas that are impacted by those two regions. I'd like to welcome you to this session for the Cambridge Festival. I would also like to introduce you to, or to set the groundwork for introducing you to Professor Samuel Liu, who will be presenting a lecture today, which is going to be entitled Before Gallipoli, There Was Homer, the New Trojan War of 1915. Now, by word of introduction, it's useful to say that Professor Liu is currently the president of the International Union of Academies, and he's a by-fellow at Robinson College in Cambridge. He has a very illustrious career, having most recently been Professor of Ancient History at Macquarie University in Australia. But he was a student at the University of Cambridge at Emmanuel College. He went on to do a DPhil in Oxford. He was a JRF, also in Oxford, and then held posts at Warwick University for many years before moving to Australia. So before moving on to the lecture itself, I'd just like to say hello to Sam and welcome him.
Hello.
So there's going to be a lecture that's going to be presented now. And then at the end, Sam and I will have a bit of a conversation and discussion. So I'll hand over to Sam, and we'll see you after the presentation.
Right. In early September 1914, the First Lord of the Admiralty, the Right Honourable Winston Churchill, MP, was taking his customary morning walk across the Horse Guards Parade to the Admiralty when he was accosted by a very well-built and athletic-looking young man with a tropical suntan. It was not money that this colonial mugger was after, but something much more precious than sovereigns or guineas at this early and still heady stage of the Great War. He wanted a military commission. The conflict was barely a month old then, and the British Expeditionary Force, now in action in Europe, consisted almost entirely of units of the professional British Army. The volunteer-based Kitchener's New Army was still a thing of the future, and military commissions for those with no association with the regular armed forces were not easy to come by. The young colonial had returned to the land of his birth from the Antipodes with a brief period of adventure as a mercenary in the Civil War then raging in Mexico, and was eager to put his military experience to good use. Churchill had already been informed of the young man's urge to fight for king and empire through a common acquaintance, and immediately recommended him to join the Royal Naval Division, the RND, an outfit which Churchill himself had helped to create and of which he was immensely proud. Formed in August 1914, the RND comprised three main elements: the highly professional Royal Marines, the Fleet Reserve, largely made up of sailors who had to accept service on land when warships of the fleet were fully crewed, and the Naval Volunteer Reserve, the ranks of which were filled mainly by recruits who had no naval antecedents but were attracted by the naval background of the force. Some of you will probably know the identity of our Antipodean volunteer, as he was one of the most famous names to be associated with the RND. However, for the sake of drama and suspense, I would like to keep his name undercover until the very end of my lecture, and you will see then my fully justified reason for doing so. His encounter with Churchill at the Horse Guards Parade was not a myth, as the incident was confirmed by Winston Churchill himself in 1960 in conversation with one of his earlier biographers, who was also a personal friend of the Antipodean volunteer who accosted Churchill. The R&D retained some of the great British naval traditions, even while on land, like flying the white ensign and using naval ranks rather than army equivalents. Distinctive too was the wearing of naval blues by officers and ratings in the early stages of the war. However, thinking that he was about to join an infantry or marine type outfit, our Antipodean volunteer got his Savile Row tailor to make him a complete naval uniform in army khaki. And he was immediately nicknamed Khaki Jack from the first day he arrived at the R&D base camp at Betty's Hangar, the estate of Lord Northbourne in Kent. He was gazetted temporary lieutenant in the Royal Naval Voluntary Reserve, the equivalent of the rank of captain in the British Army. Khaki Jack was given command of the Hood Battalion of the R&D. The 4 battalions of the 2nd Naval Brigade of the division, each consisting of about 900 officers and other ranks, were all named after famous British admirals, Hood, Anson, Howe, and Nelson. And there was a steady corps of officers for sea duty. And as the army had no more reserve officers left, the R&D was the one outfit in 1914 which could absorb a steady stream of newly commissioned officers who had been amateur sailors who were drawn to its colors because of its eccentricity. Prior to returning to the country of his birth, he was born in Richmond, Surrey. Khaki Jack had been training to be a dental assistant in the country to which his parents had emigrated with their young family in the last decade of the 19th century. He had shown no academic or scholarly ambition whatsoever, even though he did attend one of the best day schools the dominion in which he grew up could provide. Almost all the sub-lieutenants under his command, however, were products of the Edwardian public school system and had received their temporary commissions in the R&D through personal friendship with Churchill or with his private secretary, Edward Marsh, a great promoter of the arts at the turn of the last century. Several were members of a glittering social network, self-named the Corrupt Coterie, and were all thoroughly versed in Greek and Latin classics from both school and university. The best known among them was the young poet Rupert Brooke, already in the process of establishing himself as the leading poet of the new conflict, although the R&D's recent inglorious withdrawal from Antwerp in Belgium was his sole personal experience of war so far. An old boy of rugby school and an undergraduate at King's College, Brooke had been a classic scholar at Cambridge. Although he did not obtain a first in either part of the classical tripos, he was nevertheless eulogized by his patron Edward Marsh as the best writer of Greek there has been since the Greeks. Brooke was later awarded a fellowship at King's in English literature for his fellowship dissertation on the Jacobean dramatist John Webster. Brooke would later have the honor of being the first fellow of a Cambridge college to die on active service in the Great War, even though he spent hardly any time in Cambridge after his admission to the fellowship. Even more respected as a classical scholar than Brooke by the junior officers of the Hood Battalion was Patrick Shaw-Stewart. An Eton-educated Scot, Shaw-Stewart hailed from a military family and inherited a singular determination to succeed. At Eton, he was 1 year junior to Ronald Knox, the future Catholic theologian and apologist. And like his friend and rival, he was the top classic scholar at Eton in his year. In 1906, Shaw-Stewart was one among the so-called Eton Push, which saw 17 Etonians gaining entry to Balliol, Oxford, out of an intake of 54, fully justifying Evelyn Waugh's observation on the social domination of the Eton elite half a century later. At the end of the 19th century, Balliol men were everywhere in positions of eminence and authority, quite disproportionate to their numbers. It was said that there were 3 institutions for higher education in the country: Oxford, Cambridge, and Balliol. Shaw-Stewart went on to win the Craven, the Ireland, and the Hartford scholarships, and predictably outstanding firsts in classical moderations, i.e. mods, and literae humaniores, i.e. greats. And it was no surprise that he was offered a fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford, upon his graduation. However, he was deeply aware that he needed a sound financial base for him to remain on par socially with his aristocratic friends. So he joined Barings Bank upon graduation in 1910 and was appointed a director in 1913, the youngest in the history of Barings. His fellowship at All Souls gave him reason to maintain contact with his alma mater. He was in the United States on business when the Great War broke out. While the Hood Battalion of the RND was settling down to serious training at its base camp at Blandford, Dorset, momentous military events were taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. Britain and France had sent a fleet of old battleships, including the appropriately named HMS Agamemnon, to force the Dardanelles, the ancient Hellespont. It was intended that the British admiral in command would have enough ships, British and French, to line them up side by side and plow them through the main straits in a phalanx. Once through the narrows, the fleet would bombard the Ottoman forts, the Dardanelles, which gave their names to the straits, and then to proceed to bombard the Ottoman capital of Constantinople and bring about the capitulation of the Ottoman Empire in a decisive action. On the Asiatic shore of the Dardanelles, of course, stood the ruins of ancient Troy, rediscovered by Schliemann only a few decades previously. In one of the earliest planning documents of the Dardanelles campaign, prepared by Colonel Maurice Hankey, Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defense in January 1915, Homer was called upon to underscore the historic importance of the forthcoming land campaign. The Hellespont has always been key to history. That is what makes the Trojan War the most modern of all wars, and the Iliad the best manual for modern strategy. Some of the sub-lieutenants of the Hood Battalion were not only exceptionally well educated, they were also extraordinarily well connected socially and politically. In their ranks was Arthur Ock Asquith, Winchester and New College, Oxford, the third son of the then Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, himself a Balliol-trained classical scholar. Ock, as he was always known to his family and friends, and his sister Violet Asquith, who had come out in 1905, were personal friends of Brooke and Shaw-Stewart. When the decision was made by the Admiralty in early 1915 to send a land force to the Eastern Mediterranean to assist with the occupation of Constantinople, once the bombardment fleet had broken through the straits, Ock Asquith and Shaw-Stewart were the first members of the RND to know that the division's next destination was not the muddy trenches of Flanders, but Constantinople. When the news reached Rupert Brooke at Blandford, he immediately, that is on the 24th of February, wrote in an ecstasy of joy to Violet Asquith, the ultimate source of this information leak. "Oh, Violet, it is too wonderful for belief. I had not imagined fate would be so benign. I'm filled with confident and glorious hopes. Do you think perhaps the fort on the Asiatic corner will want quelling and will land and come to it from behind, and they'll make a sortie and meet us on the plains of Troy? It seems to me strategically so possible. Will Heroes' Tower crumble under the 15-inch guns? Will the sea be polyphloistic and wine dark and unvintageable? Shall we be a turning point in history? Oh God." The fort on the Asiatic corner needing quelling refers to either Kumkale or Hanier, both of which had recently come under heavy fire from the Royal Navy. The possibility of fighting on the legendary plains of Troy was not pure fantasy on the part of the young poet. The Entente fleet had been in action near Schliemann's Troy, and 2 days after Brooke had written to Violet Asquith, the very first Victoria Cross for the Dardanelles campaign would be awarded to Lieutenant Commander Eric Robinson of the Fleet Marines for his outstanding bravery in action near Troy on the 26th of February, 1915. The latter landed at Kumkale on the Asiatic shore of the Dardanelles with a small party of British Marines and fought virtually a solo Trojan war by destroying a number of Turkish guns positioned near a tumulus popularly known as the Tomb of Achilles. Brooke and his classically educated fellow officer, therefore, had every hope to be landed somewhere near Kumkale or Besika Bay on the Asian shore of the Dardanelles and prove their manhood on the plains of windy Troy against modern-day Trojans, the appropriately named Teucri, from Greek Tukros, in the opening book of Virgil's Aeneid, which they would have all known by heart. In fact, Turkey, Turks, equals Teucri, Trojans, was more than just a fortuitous pun, as the phonetic similarity between the two names was seized upon by the Ottoman Turks to justify their claim to territories in mainland Europe. Heroes' Tower was associated in Roman times with the Roman city of Sestos, and was the endpoint of Leander's nocturnal swim across the Hellespont, a form of exertion which left Byron, who swam from Europe to Abydos on the 3rd of May in 1810, wondering whether Leander's conjugal powers must not have been exhausted in his passage to paradise. The 15-inch guns, which threatened to obliterate the tower, were those of the new super dreadnought HMS Queen Elizabeth, the most powerful battle wagon to be employed in softening up the Turkish coastal defenses. Despite his classical training, Brooke rarely made classicizing references in his poems and letters. His much-cited letter to Violet Asquith, therefore, is an interesting exception. Troy mania had definitely brought out the classicist in him. The word polyphloisbik, transliteration of the Greek polyphloisbos, meaning loud roaring, is a typical Homeric word and is attested no more than a dozen times in Greek literature. It was certainly not in popular use in 1915 as a loanword in English, just the sort of word that some unsuspecting undergraduate would be asked to define on University Challenge. Wine dark and unharvested are traditional translations of the Homeric epithets for the Aegean, but unvintageable, however, looks like a coterie in-joke. The Royal Naval Division was reviewed on the 25th of February 1915 by Winston Churchill, accompanied by his wife Clementine and the ubiquitous Violet Asquith, both on horseback because the camp was a sea of mud. 2 days later, the officers and men of the Hood Battalion boarded the converted liner SS Grantaley Castle at Avonmouth. Violet Asquith, who came on board to see them off, recorded in her diary, "Rupert walked with me along the narrow, crowded decks down the plank stairs. I said goodbye to him. I saw in his eyes that he felt sure we should never see each other again. The decks were densely crowded with splendid khaki figures, with happy, confident faces. The thought of the Athenian expedition against Syracuse flashed irresistibly through my head." As we all know, the Athenian expedition against Syracuse in Sicily, launched with great fanfare in June 415 BCE, turned out to be a complete disaster for both her land and naval forces 2 years later. The parallelism is entirely apt in view of the equally disastrous outcome of the Dardanelles campaign for the Entente powers, and all the more poignant as Violet Asquith chose it over the gathering of the Achaean fleet at Aulis, which presaged an eventually successful Trojan War, at least for the Achaeans. The gentlemen officers of the Hood Battalion, now en route to the Eastern Mediterranean, were promptly dubbed Argonauts by their friend Edward Marsh in emulation of the mythical voyage of Jason and his fellow mariners through the Hellespont and the Bosporus. Conditions on board the modern-day Argo, however, were certainly not those of a Mediterranean cruise, to which the Edwardian upper classes were customarily entitled. The Howe Battalion, one of the 4 battalions of the 2nd Naval Brigade, came down with meningitis just before the embarkation, and thus secured an entire transport for itself. The Grantelli Castle, therefore, had to take on board both the Hood and Ensign battalions, as well as the brigade staff, which greatly contributed to the discomfort of both officers and men. Still, the idea of a free passage to the fabled Isles of Greece and Troy as well was worth the discomfort. And on the eve of the voyage, an optimistic Shaw-Stewart wrote, "This is the Grantelli Castle, Union Castle Line, and a very comfortable boat. I'm sharing a cabin with Dennis Brown, a musician and friend of Brooke from Rugby, who is very jolly, and looking forward enormously to the voyage, which will probably last about 3 weeks. It is great luck for me to see the Greek islands so inexpensively too, which I've always longed to do. I do hope I may be able to nip over and have a look at Troy. I don't think this is going to be at all a dangerous campaign. We shall only have to sit in the Turkish forts after the fleet had shelled the unfortunate occupants out of them." Picture Dennis Brown. The Grantelli Castle arrived at Malta on the 8th of March, and the young officers had a chance to enjoy an evening of Tosca at the island's famous Valletta Royal Opera House, now sadly in ruins as a result of aerial bombardment in April 1942. Shaw-Stewart was delighted to meet up at Malta with Charles Lister, a close friend from Eton and Balliol. The Honourable Charles Lister was the only surviving son of the 4th Baron of Ribblesdale. He had served as a British diplomat in Rome and Constantinople, and his published private letters from the Ottoman capital are still regarded as an exceptionally well-informed and reliable source on the diplomatic activities which took place during the vital period leading up to the Turkish declaration of war. He had joined the Middlesex Hussars in 1914, but he got himself swiftly transferred to the R&D in order to be with his school friends. The next stop would give most of the neo-Argonauts their first taste of Greece, a land whose ancient language and culture had occupied so much of their minds at schools and university. The SS Grantelli Castle, anchored in Mudros Bay, at the island of Lemnos on the 11th of March. A classical education was very handy indeed for these officers as provider of material for circumlocutions, essential for circumventing military censorship in their letters home. Thus, Charles Lister would describe Lemnos cryptically in a letter to a lady friend as the island of Philoctetes, the Homeric hero whom the Greeks found a disagreeable companion, as he had had his foot bitten by a snake and then marooned on these hills, as Lister says, en route for Troy. The island had been a bone of contention between the Byzantine and Venetians, and later between the Venetians and the Ottomans. The cultural linguistic diversity of the island was an immediate attraction to the polyglot officers of the Hood. A group of them cycled to Castro, now Marina, on the site of the impressive Turkish fort on the other side of the island, where Asquith, who had been in political, i.e. colonial, service in the Sudan, tried out his Arabic on the native inhabitants. Charles Lister, his recently acquired Turkish, and Shaw-Stewart, his, quote, rudimentary Greek. A fellow sub-lieutenant on board the SS Stanley Cassin, who was not in the Hood, but in the Ancient Battalion of the RND, was a more recently graduated Cambridge classics scholar. Arthur Warden St. Clair Tisdall, Bedford School and Trinity, was born in Bombay, and he had actually sailed through the Dardanelles as a child with his family on his return to England from India in 1900. He was a Chancellor's Medalist in classics at Cambridge, and like Brooke, was also a poet, though little of his poetic corpus has survived. The two had met after the retreat from Antwerp, when the Ancient Battalion, in which Brooke then served, was temporarily stationed at Chatham. Offloaded with the Ancient Battalion on Lemnos, Tisdall too spent time among the inhabitants of the Greek island. Unlike his fellow classically trained officers in the RND who merely wanted to impress the natives with their knowledge of all the main languages of the Ottoman Empire, Tisdall took a more serious interest in the predominantly Greek-speaking population of Lemnos, whose native island had only been freed from the Ottoman yoke as recently as 1912. It was indeed fortunate that for the over-optimistic Greeks whom Tisdall encountered, that the island of Lemnos remained in Greek hands after the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, and did not share the fate of nearby Imbros, Kokshetau, which was also mainly Greek-speaking, but which was successfully reclaimed by Turkey. Tisdall was presently surprised by a local Greek schoolmaster who posed a question from the Athenian historian Xenophon in a manner entirely comprehensible to a Cambridge-trained classicist. It is indeed remarkable that Xenophon was then part of the curriculum of the Greek speakers on an island that had only just become part of Greece. Lemnos was also the site of one of the most artistically important finds from antiquity made during the Dardanelles campaign. Photos of a statue of Eros recovered by French soldiers practicing trench digging at Palaiopolis on Bunia Bay circulated worldwide, and the hoisting of this objet d'art aboard one of the waiting ships of the Entente was captured on one of the very few documentary film footage from the campaign. The French officer who made the discovery gave a statement to the press. With so much of the war to report in general, and of the Dardanelles campaign in particular, an English version of the statement was not circulated until the end of the campaign, when interest in its classical associations was fast fading. The same article reported that the French officer presented his find to the Greek authorities, hoping that it would have some effect in deciding the attitude of Greece in favor of the Allies. This manifestly political gesture was sadly futile, as the pro-Entente Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos had resigned on the 21st of February 1915, and only after he was returned to power over a politically divided Greece with the help from the forces of the Entente, that Greece entered the war formally on the 24th of November 1916. Too late by then to influence the outcome of the Dardanelles campaign. The statue was eventually returned to Lemnos and became the centerpiece of the Lemnos Museum's display of finds from the Italian excavations carried out between the two world wars at Hephaestia. The original records of the find had obviously been lost, and a famous photograph of the find was often wrongly labeled in some publications as part of the later French excavations on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The error had been pointed out to the keepers of the Lemnos Museum of Archaeology by the present author and has hopefully been corrected. For the officers of the Hood Battalion, the Greek idyll was temporarily cut short as the Gallipoli Cassin sailed for Turkish waters on the 17th of March. As a ship near the Gallipoli Peninsula, there was a stand to, and the battalion was told to prepare for landing on hostile shores on the next day. However, this turned out to be a feint designed to make the Turks disclose their defensive positions in the Suvla Bay area. On the same fateful day, the 18th of March, 1915, the naval part of the Dardanelles campaign took a decisive turn for the worse. 4 battleships of the Entente bombardment fleet were sunk or heavily damaged thanks to an additional line of Turkish mines laid in the calmer waters of Erenköy Bay. Instead of landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the Hood Battalion returned to Lemnos after accomplishing the first of 2 feint actions it would be called upon to carry out in the campaign. The Gallipoli Castle raised her anchor again on the 24th of March, and Port Said in Egypt was reached about the 27th of March to enable the cargoes hastily loaded before the ships left England to be reloaded so that they could be more readily deployable for the landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Some of the officers, like Shaw-Stewart, were able to pay a visit to friends at Cairo and even managed a quick tour of the pyramids. The second cruise began at 6 a.m. on the 10th of April, and for this part of the voyage, conditions were very much improved, as the ship now carried only the Hood Battalion. The young officers were able to dine together, and their table in the officers' mess was soon known as the Latin table or the Latin Club. This second part of the long voyage of the modern-day Argo was certainly the intellectual highlight for many of these adventure-seeking classical scholars in full bloom of youth. Murdros Harbour on Lemnos, however, was by now too full of ships because of the impending land invasion of Gallipoli, and Gallipoli Castle was diverted to the Greek island of Skyros, and she anchored at Trebuka Bay, now a naval station, on the 17th of April. Rupert Brooke had suffered from serious sunstroke and dysentery during their short stay in Egypt, and by the 9th of April, a distinct swelling appeared on the right side of his upper lip. He was delighted to learn on arrival at Skyros that his name had overnight become a byword for patriotism back in England, as his sonnet, The Soldier, had been cited by Dean Inge in full in a sermon at St. Paul's Cathedral on Easter Monday, which was 5th of April in that year. Brooke was by now clearly unwell and was showing signs of acute blood poisoning soon after his arrival at Skyros. He was transferred on the 22nd of April to a French hospital ship, but died a day later on the afternoon of the 23rd of April, 2 days before the start of the land campaign. A quick decision was made by his friends to bury him on the island, and a secretive burial service took place that same evening. A makeshift cross with an epitaph in classicizing modern Greek, which made abundantly clear his crusading zeal to any inquisitive local Greek inhabitant, was inscribed in pencil by a native interpreter picked up by the Argonauts. Here lies the servant of God, a sub-lieutenant of the British Navy, who died for the deliverance of Constantinople from the Turks. The Greek interpreter was probably not informed by his masters that the deceased was also a poet of some note. Skyros was then part of Greece and not officially leased like Lemnos to the Entente powers. It was therefore neutral territory at the time of Brooke's death. Given the fact that Brooke, a belligerent, was strictly speaking illegally buried on the island, the wording of his epitaph in Greek was clearly dictated by the popular desire of the time to recreate a Byzantine state with its capital at Constantinople out of the crumbling Ottoman Empire, and by the fear of disinterment. Furthermore, the task of giving Brooke's correct naval rank in Greek and the standard abridged form of Constantinople in Greek of the Ottoman period, kun polis, was not part of the classical training of his comrades in arms. It may seem strange to scholars that in the presence of a coterie of public school and Oxford and Cambridge educated classicists, the duty of composing an epitaph in Greek should have fallen almost by accident on the shoulders of an interpreter whom Ock Asquith had picked up at Lemnos, and not on those of one of Brooke's fellow classically trained officers. At least 3 of them, Asquith, Shaw-Stewart, and Leicester, would have been seasoned in composition of Greek poetry. In fact, Charles Lister ended a short letter to his father about Brooke's burial with the lines, "At Skyros, we had a blow in the loss of Rupert Brooke. He died of blood poisoning, and we buried him in a grove of olives tucked deep in a rocky ravine under Mount Pavli," with 5 words in Greek, which means, "But they live, your nightingales." Those 5 words are a pedantic or critic reference to the nightingales found in a well-known epigram of the Hellenistic poet Callimachus on the death of his friend Heraclitus. The nightingales and the epigram are also a metaphor for the poetic spirit, and Lister would have undoubtedly hoped that Brooke's poetic spirit would live on in some ways. The epigram of Callimachus in its full version would have also been the most fitting epitaph for a classical scholar come poet. The 2 flimsy wooden crosses left by his mates on the night of the 23rd of April at Trabuki Bay to mark his grave were replaced after the Great War by a monumental construction using 2 tons of Scyrian marble. The construction work undertaken in 1921 was supervised by Stanley Cassin, then Deputy Director of the British School of Athens, and later Lincoln Professor of Classical Archaeology at Oxford, and noted for his seminal work on the historical geography of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The original epitaph composed by the Greek interpreter was replaced by one in English and carved in marble, quoting Brooke's most famous war poem, which reminds visitors that his final resting place is a corner which is forever England. One wonders, though, whether as a classical scholar, Brooke would have preferred to be remembered for being buried on Greek soil and on an island where Achilles tried to seek exemption from military service in the forthcoming war against Troy by disguising as a maiden. Back in England, there was universal mourning for the death of this idealistic young poet who had so recently become a national icon. Winston Churchill, who had only known him briefly, broke the news of the nation with his famous but brief obituary of the poet in the Times of 26th of April, and berated Edward Marsh, his private secretary, for not bringing them together sooner. One of Brooke's closest friends, Jacques Riveret, a French national and husband of Gwen, of period pieces fame, wrote to the philosopher André Gide, "We had, he and I, so many projects afoot, and one of my regrets is also that he did not know you, and that you did not know him. His death there so near Greece and Troy. Lines from Troilus and Cressida came to mind. Hector is dead. There is no more to say." Several lines of poetry were found on a piece of note paper from HMS Queen Elizabeth, on board which Brooke and his fellow R&D officers enjoyed a party shortly before his death. In them, Brooke clearly saw the ongoing naval bombardment of the Troad as the opening act of the new Trojan War. Other lines he wrote, probably at the early part of the voyage, juxtapose a campaign featuring the mighty naval guns and the mythical clash of Olympian deities were also discovered. Another fragment mentions Sarpedon, the son of Zeus and Laodamia, and the bravest among the Trojan allies. Had Brooke survived the campaign, his poems, written as a participant, might well have made him the Homer of the new Trojan War. While the Hood Battalion was diverted to Skyros, the Ancient Battalion returned to Lemnos, and a small detachment was involved in the preparation for the inevitable landing against hostile shores. On the 16th of April, Tisdall wrote to a Cambridge friend that he was on board with his men on a collier. This was no other than HM transport ship River Clyde, a 10-year-old Glasgow-built collier, which was converted to become a landing ship with sally ports and gangways. The plan was to run it aground near Cape Helles at the southern tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula and speedily land a substantial body of men. The idea was sold by its designer, Commander E. Irwin, as the Trojan horse, adding yet another Homeric allusion to the campaign already redolent with mythological associations. Alas, the modern-day Trojan horse did not achieve for the British military what its mythological counterpart did so famously for the Achaeans. The River Clyde and her attendant lighters came to ground at V Beach, in full view of the defenders strongly entrenched in and about the now battered Ottoman fort of Saddle Bahir at 6:22 hours on the morning of the 25th of April, 1915. The modern-day Tukri, unfortunately for the Allies, were not in drunken torpor, but wide awake and ready for battle. As the British troops rushed out of the belly of their Trojan horse, they were slaughtered in their hundreds by Turkish machine guns, trained on the specially constructed side doors and gangways of the collier. This piece of military incompetence would not be forgotten by its victims, mainly Royal Dublin and Royal Munster Fusiliers, and memory of this fiasco would be immortalized in two lines of the famous 1919 Irish rebel song, The Foggy Dew by Canon Charles O'Neill. "'Twas far better to die 'neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Saddle Bar." Tisdall would be awarded the nation's highest decoration for valor for his selfless bravery in rescuing some of the hundreds of those wounded at the V Beach landings. His Victoria Cross was not gazetted until the 31st of March, 1916, because he was one of only a few officers from the R&D involved in the landings and was virtually unknown to the majority of Army officers who took part. Though he survived the slaughter at V Beach, Tisdall was killed less than a fortnight later in the Second Battle of Krithia on the 6th of May. Few would disagree with Stephen Snelling, the author of the History of Victoria Cross Recipients at Gallipoli, that, like his famous comrade in arms, Rupert Brooke, Tisdall was cut down in the prime of a life which promised greatness. Nearly 80 years after his death, Snelling wrote in 1995, he still appears to embody that intoxicating brand of romantic idealism which carried so many of his generation's best and brightest to destruction on the shores of Gallipoli. The Hood Battalion was detailed to conduct the second of their famed moves in the campaign by a noisy show of strength to give the impression of an impending amphibious assault against the neck of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Here, Khaki Jack saved many of his comrades from being certain casualties by proving his worth as an Olympic standard swimmer. He won the first Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, for the Hood Battalion, and the first of 3 for himself by making a dangerous solo swim from his ship to shore at night on the 24th of April, and planting flares to give the impression of large-scale landing on the Gulf of Saros, where the Balliol lines terminated. However, for many Entente officers who had yet to prove their manhood on the windy plains of Ilios, the Dardanelles campaign of 1915 would ultimately prove to be a supreme anticlimax, as it never eventuated in a new Trojan War fought on the legendary Trojan Plain. Only a small French contingent, mainly colonial troops from Senegal, landed near the site of Schliemann's Troy in a brief feint attack on Kumkali, at the same time as the main landings on the shore of Gallipoli Peninsula. Some of the mobile Turkish batteries, which the French landing force tried to silence in 1915, were in fact concealed in the ruins of Schliemann's Troy, in the hope that the Entente commanders would not direct their artillery at a sacred site. One Turkish gun, which fired on Entente forces who landed at Cape Helles on the European side of the Dardanelles, was quickly named Helen of Troy. In the battles following the landings, shellfire and trenching and tunneling regularly threw up ancient potsherds, jars, and coins. Entente troops fighting at Cape Helles were quick to notice that one of the mobile Turkish batteries, nicknamed Asiatic and Annie, was actively disinterring antiquities, especially 2 jars containing skeletons. The discovery of ancient artifacts behind French lines, not far from Mortal Bay and near where the Martyrs Memorial, the Abide, now stands, led to some archaeological excavation. The site was soon identified as a necropolis, belonging to the Greek city of Ilios, a city which has strong connections with Athens and the classical period, and after which the modern Cape Helles or Elis was named. Ancient Greek and Roman coins were sported and pocketed with great regularity. One classically trained English school leaver, Second Lieutenant Claye of the Cheshire Regiment, who first saw action in Gallipoli after a secondary landing at Suvla Bay in August, had no difficulty in identifying one of the coins he found was an issue from the ancient city of Sestos on the Dardanelles. On the 6th of September 1915, he wrote to his old headmaster at the Perse School, the famous classical scholar Dr. W.H.D. Rouse, a fellow of Christ's, Cambridge, who pioneered the teaching of Greek and Latin by direct method, that is, by teaching the pupils to converse in the ancient languages at the highly selective Perse School at Cambridge. After leaving Egypt, we had a very interesting voyage through the Aegean among the islands that I expect you know very well. After a very short stay at Lemnos, we are at the front. At present, we are out of the trenches and are in a rest camp by the sea. It is a very restful sport, except when the Turks take to shelling us. In the other offices of my company, a comfortable dugout on the side of the standing cliff looking westward to Samothrace. We have found several interesting remains there in the course of our digging, rough pottery and a few coins. I could just make out Sest on one the other day, so I suppose it came from Sestos on the other side of the peninsula. It was quite near the sea and about 5 feet down. The letter is unpublished, and I'm grateful to Miss Charlotte Byrne, library assistant at Christ's College, Cambridge, for drawing my attention to it through the website created by her for Christ's at War exhibition, the 9th to the 10th on September 2011. Claye survived the Gallipoli campaign, but was killed in action in Gaza on the 27th of March, 1917, and never had the opportunity to take up the study of classics at Cambridge. For much of the campaign, the dominant geographical feature on the skyline was not the hoped-for Mount Ida towering over the Trojan plain, but especially for the Anzacs and those who fought at Suvla Bay, the island of Samothrace, crowned by the highest mountain in the region. The sight of Mount Fangari on the horizon, dwarfing the islands of Lemnos and Imbros, soon became familiar to Entente personnel, especially those who traveled regularly between the island of Imbros and the peninsula in the course of the campaign. Shaw-Stewart was one of the officers who crossed over regularly to the Greek island of Imbros, now Turkish Gökçeada, for short periods of leave. In July 1915, he was granted 3 days leave, and the return from the tranquility of the island to active duty occasioned the composition of the most famous of all the classicizing poems to emerge from the Dardanelles campaign. This was found later, after his death, scribbled in pencil on the fly-leaf of his copy of A.E. Houseman's The Shropshire Lad. And this contains the famous lines: Achilles came to Troyland, and I to Chersonese. He turned from wrath to battle, and I from 3 days' peace. Was it so hard, Achilles, so very hard to die? Thou knewest, and I know not, so much the happier I. I will go back this morning from Imbros over the sea. Stand in the trench, Achilles, flame-capped, and shout for me. The decision to withdraw the naval forces from the Dardanelles and the gradual evacuation of all Entente personnel from the Gallipoli Peninsula was made in late autumn 1915, after the unsuccessful major attack against the Turkish lines in August and after the landing of additional troops at Suvla, which failed to outflank the same defenses. By then, Dennis Brown had been killed in action and Charles Lister had died of wounds. Patrick Shaw-Stewart, Lister's closest friend and from his Eton days, survived the campaign unscathed. His brief career as a banker after leaving Oxford had helped him to acquire a good knowledge of spoken French, and he was taken off the firing line to serve as a liaison officer at the French headquarters at Cape Helles, where he found time to read more of the histories of Herodotus and even some Gibbon and Macaulay. And he also managed to spend 48 hours in Athens, for which he said, I machinated for months. He even managed to give some talks to fellow officers on Homeric archaeology, using as his guide the very popular Walter Lee's book on Troy, a study in Homeric geography. He would perform the same role as the liaison officer with the French forces in the subsequent and now largely forgotten campaign in Macedonia and northern Greece. There he was able to remain in contact with the so-called Silver Age of the Hellenic past. He rejoined the Hood Battalion in France in May 1917 and was in temporary command of the Hood Battalion when he was killed in action on the 30th of December at the battle for the control of the so-called Welsh Ridge. Patrick Shaw-Stewart's short but brilliant life is the subject of a belated but highly readable biography in 2010 by Miles Jebb. But since the author is not a classical scholar, he doesn't readily appreciate the nuances of Shaw-Stewart's classical references in his famous poem and his letters. For example, in his brief commentary on the Homeric background of Shaw-Stewart's famous poem, he saw no significance on the epithet fatal Helen. In the classical period, the name Helen, Helene, was often seen as etymologically related to Hellein, the aorist infinitive of the verb hyreo, to seize, to subdue, and to conquer. Shaw-Stewart had clearly had in mind the chorus in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, in which Helen was condemned by the Greek chorus as ship's hell, man's hell, city's hell. Stand in the trench, Achilles, the most famous line from Shaw-Stewart's poem, is the title of an outstanding work on British poetry of the Great War by Elizabeth Van Diver, a classical scholar and a specialist in classical reception. But she devoted only 14 out of 404 pages of her monograph to Shaw-Stewart and made use of only a handful of his letters, which contain classical references. In his first letter to Violet Asquith, after he had heard the news that he was heading for Gallipoli, Rupert Brooke fantasized that she would come out to manage a base hospital on a Greek island, Lesbos perhaps, tending the wounded of the forthcoming campaign. She was paying a visit to Ireland, then still within the British Pale, when she received the news of the poet's death on Skyros. She worked briefly in Alexandria during the campaign, setting up an information service for the next of kin of Royal Navy and R&D personnel wounded in the campaign, and met up with her brother Ock Asquith and Khaki Jack, both recovering from wounds received on the peninsula. Ock rose to the rank of Brigadier General and became the embodiment of the heroism and sacrifice of the Royal Naval Division for the rest of his life. He died of complications arising from his war wounds 5 days before the outbreak of the Second World War. His sister, Violet Lady Bonham Carter, remained in public eye for the rest of her life as the leading figure in the Liberal Party, becoming the party president from 1945 to 1947. And in 1964, she was created Baroness Asquith of Yanbury. She died in 1969, aged 82. At the luncheon at Blandford on that memorable day before the Hood Battalion set sail for the Dardanelles, Violet sat next to Khaki Jack, who confided to her, I am different from Og and Rupert. I have got to make my own fortune, as well as England's, out of this war. And this he certainly did. Bernard Freyberg, aka Khaki Jack, was awarded the Victoria Cross on the Western Front for his utter contempt of danger and outstanding leadership at the Battle of Beaucourt-sur-Ancre on the 13th of November 1916. He led with equal distinction the 2nd New Zealand Division during the Second World War, but also incurred considerable controversy for the avoidable loss of the island of Crete to a German airborne assault in 1941, and 3 years later for insisting that the medieval monastery of Monte Cassino be bombed from the air to reduce Allied, especially New Zealand, casualties. He was made Governor General of New Zealand after the war and was frequently referred to mistakenly as the first New Zealand-born person to hold the post. Knighted in 1941, he was raised to peerage as Baron Freyberg of Wellington in New Zealand and Munstead, the name of his estate in Surrey, in 1951. The last surviving original officer of the Hood Battalion, Khaki Jack, died in 1963 at the age of 74 from complications arising from a wound he received in Gallipoli. Despite his many outstanding services to King and two countries, Britain and New Zealand, and his innumerable awards for gallantry, including the Victoria Cross, for many years, a photograph of Bernard Freyberg hanging on the wall of the Rupert Brooke Museum at Grantchester had him wearing a civilian suit and labeled as Bernard Freyberg, the distinguished Cambridge classical scholar. You'll be glad to know that this manifest error is now no longer on display at this said museum. One of Freyberg's earliest biographers had already made the obvious remark that there was almost nothing in the educational system of New Zealand that could have given him a similar development to that of his fellow Argonauts. And he could recall, but probably not understand, the Latin texts to which they flung at each other under bombardment. For Bernard Freyberg, VC, to be such a prominent Argonaut, a classical education so conspicuously missing in his career had to be provided honoris causa. In an ancient university town, distinguished for the study of the classics, and in the context of him being one of Brooke's inner circle of friends, it is the only qualification that mattered.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was fascinating, fantastic, erudite, and interesting as always. I've basically been taking a few notes while you were speaking, and there were a whole series of things that were of interest to me. I mean, you know, double aspects of it, in a sense of being somebody who studied classical archaeology more broadly, and I'm also Australian. So, I mean, I'm conscious that the Gallipoli campaign in general, it has a very strong resonance with national identity in Australia, but it's much less known in the UK in terms of the sort of the broader Great War narrative. It's almost literally a side note in many respects, as opposed to like the Western Front and other sorts of aspects. Is that something that's characteristic of the histories of the period that you've encountered? I mean, is that just a sort of perception?
Yes, I think the slaughter on the Western Front was so enormous that inevitably it held the limelight for any history of the First World War. Gallipoli was a sideshow of a sideshow.
Right.
Only thing about it is that it was the only campaign in which a large number of classical scholars were able to join and fight in the same unit.
Well, that's astonishing. I mean, I to be honest, I think Rupert Brooke, again, takes the limelight in the sense because he was so prominent and also died I mean, it must have been.
And he's a Cambridge man.
He was a Cambridge man, absolutely, but he also must have been one of the first extremely famous people to have died during the war. Is that?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes. In some ways, he dominated the narrative, except he didn't actually do any of the fighting because he died before it all started, whereas his friends like Shaw-Stewart and Bernard Fryeburg did. And that's the reason why I kept Bernard Fryeburg's identity masked until the very end, to remind people that there are figures in the Hood Battalion who became almost as famous, but didn't quite make it to in popular imagination. Even in this case, in Bernard Fryeburg's case, it was almost inexcusable. He is a Victoria Cross holder, the most decorated for bravery officer of the British Army, and yet somebody would misidentify him as a classical scholar. Yes,
in Cambridge of all places as well, you know, in a sense. Yeah, I mean, he's the fact that he, you know, became Governor General of New Zealand and all of these other things. So this is an extremely, you know, lauded individual in terms of his lifetime and other sorts of things. So it is interesting though. This, I mean, you set up a nice contrast with the fact that he himself wasn't a classical scholar and managed actually to outlast all of the others and survive. So I mean, surviving the war and other things. I mean, it is this whole perception of the Hood Battalion as well. I mean, was that normal that the battalions of the R&D were both involved in naval operations and fighting on the land, and that became sort of less necessary for them to be active?
They fought on the land throughout the whole of the First World War because there was not enough room for them to fight in the Navy. The Navy was basically oversubscribed by volunteers.
Right.
Yes.
And it's one of those aspects that's often spoken about in Australia, this concept of mateship and people joining up together to try and join similar units. So it's quite interesting that the Hood Battalion managed to bring together all of these classicists.
Yes.
In their very, very interesting idealized view. I mean, it is, I was thinking, in a sense, you described them as being idealistic youths and the way that they were envisaging the war. And I mean, it struck me that attitude was relatively common in the early phases of the war, as far as I'm aware. You know, there was a general view of idealism, but this is almost like a double layer of it.
Yes.
With these classical scholars, you know, the new Argonauts going off to fight another Trojan war. It's almost like an extra layer. I mean, were those views, were they very, very restricted? I mean, is that the thing, that their neo-Argonaut almost like ideology, was that was pretty much contained to that small group, or was it something that was more prevalent?
I think there was a general sharing of the fact that they are going to fight a very unusual war, and one which has got a longer sort of historical backdrop than any other part of the First World War. In fact, even though many Australians who fought in the Anzac forces were not classically educated, they still talked about the bravery of Hector and Ajax, and many of the trench doggerels, especially epitomized by the famous Anzac book, contains references to Sappho, to sort of the islands, and of course to Menelaus, Troy, Agamemnon, etc., because they all had read something about that in translation at school. And even rugby players who fought in the campaign would sort of mention the archaeological discoveries made on the peninsula. The important thing about the elitism of this particular group is that they wrote, and people wrote about them. It's much easier to rediscover what that particular group said and thought about. Whereas the classicism, in inverted commas, of the soldiers in the trenches in the Gallipoli is much harder to discern, except some of them do keep diaries, and I did have fun reading some of them in the Australian War Memorial. The other things to remind ourselves, of course, is that the heroism of the on both sides were very much seen in Homeric terms. And even Kemal Ataturk thought of that. He thought the Allies had a great advantage in being able to interpret the classics in the light of their own military needs. And he pointed out particularly to the individual action of Edward Robinson, which I pointed out at the very beginning of the campaign, who won the Victoria Cross, because I think he witnessed it himself.
Okay, right. It's fascinating. I mean, that was those aspects. It's interesting. I think also in the general consciousness, the Gallipoli campaign is more specifically focused on the more major landings. But those two early incursions in February and March, and particularly on the Asiatic shore and the association with Troy.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why it was such a disappointment that the campaign was fought almost entirely on European soil, and it was separated from Troy by what Homer called the broad Hellespont.
Yes, well, I mean, yeah, you use the phrase a supreme anti-climax. I mean, so it's another double layered anti-climax. So
yes, not
only is it unsuccessful, it's not even in the right place that they would like to.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, it particularly interesting. I think the degree to which this sort of idealism about the First World War, and I'm always sort of conscious that there must have been a tipping point at which, you know, this original mood of enthusiasm and things, you know, when precisely that starts to deteriorate. Because I realized that, you know, that if you look at the sort of the numbers, I mean, the Dardanelles campaign is ferocious in terms of the casualty rates and these sorts of other things. But I know, you know, as you pointed out earlier, it's dwarfed by what happens in the Western Front. So there still must have been a degree of support and enthusiasm. I mean, this is still before, unless I'm mistaken, it's before they start using conscription to increase the numbers and things in the army. So
yes, so still very much a volunteer war, the Gallipoli campaign. In fact, you made a very, very good point there. One Oxford-trained classical scholar whom I mentioned, Stanley Cassin, who helped construct the Brooke Mausoleum. He never fought on Gallipoli, but he visited Gallipoli Peninsula very shortly after the war, and his report on his travel, which is published in his book on Macedonia and Thrace, is extremely important on the historical geography of the Gallipoli Peninsula. He also wrote an extremely interesting memoir called Distant Drummer, and in which he pointed out that, like all these neo-Argonauts, he was fired by the Homeric zeal when he went to the First World War. But as he said, once the firing began, you forget all your Homer.
That's extremely interesting. Yeah. Heroism takes a back seat in terms of the face of reality in some respects.
I think he might well have met Shaw-Stewart in Macedonia, where he served, and he's also spent a great deal of time publishing the inscription from Macedonia. And later, of course, he became Lincoln Professor of Archaeology at Oxford, but sadly died in an air crash during the Second World War after masterminding the British secret, the intelligence network in the following Greek campaign.
Oh, right. Gosh, it's this is fascinating. I realize we could inevitably keep talking for an extremely long time, but I guess it would be useful to draw that to a close. But I realize there may be people that are watching this this recording who would like to ask, you know, questions and other sorts of things. So I'd like to encourage anyone that does that with you, please feel free to make comments on the bottom of the recording, or get in contact with the Ancient India and Iran Trust, and hopefully we can address the answers to the questions.
And I put my emails at the end of the talk, the last.
Yes, very good point. Thank you for the reminder. Yes. Yeah, also a direct email to Sam Yu. So I'd just like to say thank you very much, Sam, for that stimulating talk, and thank you also for answering my my questions. And I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that those of you who have watched it have also enjoyed it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.